Hello, my name is Ron Timko, and in this presentation, we will learn how to use the language experience approach to improve reading skills in students with learning disabilities. In this presentation, we will introduce the language experience approach model. We will discuss the core concepts of the LEA, including its history and its fundamental ideas. We will adapt these concepts for use in special education, and we will explore a few examples of LEA use in students with learning disabilities. And by the end, viewers of this presentation should understand what the LEA model is and how it can be applied for any educational scenario, including special education. So, what is the language experience approach? The language experience approach is a method that focuses on a student's personal experiences in oral language. It's an approach that builds upon the foundation, and especially for young students. But this is something that students of any grade level, of any language capability can benefit from. Okay, it takes their own intrinsic understanding of the language and uses that as a foundation upon which they learn how to read. And it's based on this idea that learning a language is akin to immersion in that language. By wrapping the content education within the prior schema of students, it greatly reduces the decoding time, allows for more comprehension and fluency, and a more effective way to instruct students how to read. And it utilizes the student's own transcribed words as a foundation for learning how to read. The LEA approach was created by Sylvia Ashton Warner in 1963 in a book called Teacher, where she recognized the need for student-centered pedagogy rather than state-sanctioned material. And she worked closely with Maori students in New Zealand, and we'll get into her story right now. So this is Sylvia Ashton Warner, born in 1908. She started teaching in the 1930s, where she started teaching young Indigenous children in New Zealand, Maori, kindergarten, first grade age, 5-6 years old. And like most Commonwealth regions, Indigenous people, in this case the Maori, children were placed in segregated schools, and the teachers themselves were considered second-class teachers. The state had reading methodologies that were sanctioned, but Ms. Ashton Warner realized very early on that these were not very useful for her own students. And so she realized that by utilizing her students' own prior knowledge, their Maori background, she could further engage her students in the process of reading and reading education. And she realized that her students' inner words were key to unlocking the puzzle of the printed word. And this idea of key vocabulary, which is sort of akin to sight words in a way, were based on using students' own chosen words that had a strong emotional component to them. And it's this familiarity and emotional attachment that created a really strong link between the oral and written language. And this led into the principles of the LEA that she first codified in her book Teacher, again, 1963. So the LEA approach focuses the content, on the experiences and interests of those students themselves. And it incorporates all aspects of language, not just reading and writing, but listening and speaking and storytelling. These last three in particular are very germane to younger children because this is how they grew up. They grew up hearing their parents and their family speak, their friends speak. They listened to this, and they were told stories, and they themselves might create their own stories. And one of the core ideas of the LEA approach is to use their own stories, literally record them speaking, transcribe that recording into a textbook or a text story, and use that to teach them how to read. And that's one of the core concepts of that. Okay, why do we want to focus that content? Because the task of education and cognitive development is to connect abstract, schooled, scientific concepts to those of everyday life. What that means is we want to bridge that gap between these abstract ideas that are thrown at a student in school with things they're already familiar with. And what this does is it allows students to spend more time understanding what they're being taught rather than spending time on the physical act of reading, that coding and decoding. Okay. If they're linguistically familiar with the words and those words are of relevant interest to the student, then they will be more engaged with the process. And again, students have grown up listening to people talk, hearing what they had to say, they themselves developing the ability to speak. And how do we utilize this prior knowledge? Well, we speak with our students. We talk to them. We ask them about their day. We learn about their interests. Okay, have them share their stories and use those stories as a foundation upon which you can build their ability to read. And germane to this idea, central to this idea, is this use of transcripts. Students will share their stories, their interests, their prior knowledge, their life experiences. You record those stories. You write those stories down and use that as your text. Instead of a primer that you might have had, in kindergarten, first, second grade, when you were learning to read, throw that away. Use the student's own knowledge, their own words. Okay. And it's this use of what are in effect sight words that reduces that mental processing time. Okay. Students will not spend as much time trying to figure out what these letters mean when they are arranged in certain ways. They will quickly understand that, oh, well, I use the word ball. These letters together mean ball. That's ball. Move on. Now I can understand what ball means rather than figuring out what the letters themselves are trying to represent. And so you see that these core concepts of adaptability, individualized instruction, and in some ways differentiation tie in very prominently with modern pedagogical methods in special education. Generally speaking, in special education, we are looking to individualize instruction. Okay, we want to meet the needs of each student, and we do that by individualizing the way we interact with them. We differentiate our instruction so that students can access that instruction in a way that suits their own special needs. Okay, they are sight impaired, hearing impaired, intellectually disabled in some capacity. We can meet them and give them the instruction in a manner that they can interact with. We're obviously using assistive technology all of the time. And it's this idea of tying in these thematic concepts to an overarching methodology that consistently and sometimes subtly reinforces these points at times when students may not even be aware of it. Having everything cohesively tied together in one overarching narrative makes everything more effective and efficient. Okay. And so you see that there are these intrinsic similarities with the language experience approach here. We are pulling lesson content directly from the students, individualized. We are utilizing numerous methods of instruction, AV recordings, interactive storytelling. We can even use tactile objects where students, especially sight impaired students, can have something to manipulate. Those are adaptive and assistive technologies. We are recording students' own words to use that as the foundational text. Everything is centered around the student experience to engage with them intellectually and emotionally, and to give them the confidence to learn how to read. And here we're going to look at a few experience approaches, ways to utilize the LEA model in a real-world setting. So here we have a story about using the LEA model with hearing impaired students. And traditionally, students with hearing impairments don't have their own internal language recognized. We tend not to, or teachers may tend not to think in those terms. But of course they have their own language. They have to. They have an internal monologue. They have a way to interact with what they are experiencing. And so if we can utilize that, we're going to greatly reduce the confusion for a hearing impaired child when faced with material they may not be familiar with. Okay, you're reducing that coding and decoding time. This is a core concept of the LEA model, reducing that coding and decoding time. Okay, and you create a word bank that is akin to the key vocabulary that Ms. Ashton Warner had discussed, or the idea of sight words. Okay. You are creating fluency by cutting down on that mental processing time. Here we see a use of the LEA model with remedial first graders. Okay, first graders who aren't as skilled in reading as they generally, I want to say should be, but they're not as skilled as the norm or what is expected for that age group. Okay. This uses the idea of song, poem, even finger play heavily. Okay, as students engage with this media, ideally even before they reach class or they reach school age, they have this in their brains. It's memorized. So use that to teach them how to read. They already understand intrinsically what's going on. Well, here are the words that match up what they're saying. Oh, this means ball. This means cloud. Those words become sight words much faster this way. Here we have something called the magic paper technique. This is from the 80s, where they were using a carbonless paper. Akin, and this is similar to recording text. This, however, doesn't necessarily use the student's own language itself. It's foregoing that particular aspect of it, the specific word use itself, and instead creates a word wall, okay, which helps facilitate the concept of sight words and familiarity with sight words. Okay, same concept, slightly different approach, but the end result is the same. And so here's a summary of our presentation. The language experience approach, as first described by Sylvia Ashton Warner, focused on the needs of underrepresented students and engaging those students through their own personal experience and their own understanding of the oral language. And the LEA core concepts and the special education concepts tie in very closely, dealing with individualized instruction, differentiated instruction, utilizing multiple language modes, utilizing assistive and adaptive technologies, and using the student's own words, own schema, as a foundation for teaching, education, and reading. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoy the presentation. There's a bibliography at the end in case you want to read up on any of the texts cited here. Otherwise, good luck and enjoy your teaching careers.